Welcome back to the Umbrella Hour. This is Dr. On and Zander Keig. Today we have a guest, and Zander will be introducing our guest. Zander?
Thank you, Dr. On. Hello, everybody. This is Zander. I am really happy to introduce to you our guest today. This is somebody that I've known through my work with Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Her name is Lisa Selin Davis. She is the author of Tomboy, The Surprising History and Future of Girls Who Dare to Be Different, and the forthcoming book, Housewife, Why Women Still Do It All and What to Do Instead. I can't wait to hear more about that. She has written for the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Washington Post, the Free Press, and many others. You can find her on social media at Lisa Selin Davis. Selin is Selin. Welcome, Lisa, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I mentioned that I'd like to hear more about your book. So why don't we just start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write the book, the Tomboy book, and what that process was like and how the reception has been, and then also Housewife. What were the catalysts for these books and how's that all going?
Sure. So when I had kids late in life, and when my daughter was 3 and I was 40 already, she just started being very masculine, stereotypically masculine, and she wanted short hair and she wanted boys' clothes, and she played more with boys than girls. And although I had grown up in the 70s in the kind of tomboy heyday and was quite familiar with girls like that, by that time, that would be 2012, there didn't seem to be any girls like that. And I didn't even have any cultural memory of girls like that. And we found it kind of confusing and maybe a little concerning, and also kind of fascinating, the different ways that people responded to it, which really was mostly a lot of positivity, like, oh, how cool, she's wearing a tie. Like, that stuff was awesome. But then people started to really be insisting that she was trans. And this is before we asked everybody for their pronouns. So it would just be constant. Like, we'd go to the doctor just for like a strep throat test, and they'd say, what's going on with your gender identity? And I don't even think I knew that term. And I had no idea what was happening, why she was like that, despite the fact that we have many lesbians and many masculine women on both my side and my husband's side of the family. And at first I thought it was really lovely that they were asking her. And then it turned into, they don't believe her, that they couldn't accept that there could be a masculine girl, and that they needed to know what she was. They needed to name it. And when she was in first grade, she came home and said that someone had told her she was a tomboy. And that's when I remembered the term and the trope of the tomboy from my youth. And I wondered, where had that trope disappeared to? And where had our understanding of gender nonconformity, how had it transformed? And I wrote an op-ed in 2017. It got published in the New York Times. And it was saying, I support trans kids, but I find the insistence that a girl who doesn't hew to stereotypes is trans to be troubling. As someone who was raised very hippie, feminist, free to be you and me, I don't understand why there's not room for this in the girl category. There was a lot of backlash. I had no idea that there was a culture war. I had no idea that there were tensions between feminists and trans people. I had no idea of how nasty and ferocious people could be on social media, and that I would be accused of child abuse, and that I had a son and he would kill himself because of me. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it on some level, but I also felt very uncomfortable being labeled a bigot and a transphobe, and very confused about why what I said was unacceptable. So what I ended up doing was writing to some people. Some of them had very publicly objected to my op-ed, including Chase Strangio of the ACLU, and also to Kate Bornstein, who said she liked it and it was great, right? And I went and met with these different trans people and I tried to understand their point of view. And then I ended up writing this book. And part of the book is about the history of the tomboy from the early America to the 21st century. Part of it is about a lot about changing ideas about what's boy typical and girl typical, and how the gendering of childhood has changed, and the science and psychology of gender nonconforming girls.
Well, that's just fascinating. It's also very disheartening to hear how people responded to it on that negative side of claiming that you're an abusive parent and that your kid might commit suicide. I mean, that's pretty outrageous.
But I think it's par for the course. I just had no idea. I had no idea that there was a course.
In some ways, I don't either. As a trans man, I'm not part of that trans world that would come after a mother. But I'm also, as a trans man who was previously a gender nonconforming woman and almost 57 years old, raised in the free to be you and me era as well. If the gender nonconforming champion movement had known at the time that this was the evolutionary point that we would come to, I don't think it would have been championed. But how could we have ever foreseen that championing that boys and girls can do whatever, they can wear whatever, play with whatever toys, they can be interested in whatever activities. And it was mostly girls, let's just be honest. Boys didn't get the same liberation at the time. And I don't know if they have yet. It's a sense in which you can be a police officer and you can whatever you want to be, that it would end up that now if you're gender nonconforming, you're going to get tracked into some sort of trans identity by external forces. Like that's quite troubling, actually.
One of the things I discovered was this generational waves of understandings of gender, right? So if the 70s were about tomboyism and liberating girls, they were also about impugning femininity. So there were in the Sears catalog, which is like the analog Amazon, right? There were size conversion charts so that girls could shop in the boys section, but there was no size conversion chart in the girls section so that boys could shop there. And the message was femininity is bad for everybody and it's great for girls to be masculine. And that was met with girl power. That was met with Spice Girls of the 90s, in which femininity was power, but it was also your power is being hot, right? So, and it was never like, oh, boys, you can be feminine too. And in the 90s, there was also a whole bunch of girl crisis literature. Girls are falling behind and girls are not good at math now. And whereas there had been a saying in the 19th century, science for ladies, classics for gentlemen, which people also don't seem to know. There were people who conceived of science as for girls and literature as for boys, right? So there have been these massive changes and they're often reacting. And from the 90s, we went to this real hypergendering of childhood. We went for Disney Princess line and this huge expansion with e-commerce and marketing every possible thing you could ever purchase as girl or boy, for boys or for girls. I even at one time I bought a Kindle Fire, which is a kid's tablet, and you had to choose boy or girl, and then it populated it. It populated it with apps, with music, etc., all either drenched in pink or blue. So your whole electronic world would be gendered.
Wow. You know, what comes to mind is Madonna's Material Girl.
Yeah.
I also heard, and maybe you found this in your studies, I've heard over the years that pink used to be the color for boys and blue used to be the color for girls because it was more expensive to make pink. And so they would reserve the more expensive fabrics for boys' clothes. And that in the Sears catalog, you can see way back in old-timey times that boys were wearing pink and they would wear long things that looked kind of like dresses, the clothing, maybe a sleeping gown they would be wearing. But I see that On is shaking their head that that's something that you've heard as well. And I'm wondering, Lisa, if that's something you discovered in your studies, like some of those switches like that.
Well, I know the fashion industry changed that, and I think it occurred somewhere in the 30s or 40s. Wasn't that long ago?
Yeah, pink was a hard color to produce. So it took a long time for commercial dye manufacturers to figure that out. Before the Industrial Revolution, people were making their own clothes, and pants are much harder to make than dresses. So all little kids would wear dresses. All babies would wear dresses, mostly white dresses. And then kids were not differentiated a lot in terms of what they wore until they went to school. And then what they wore and they played with were about showing them their place. But it's not really until the 1920s that gender, as I understand it, which are ideas about who you should be based on your sex, that's my definition, was imposed onto a lot of childhood. And that had to do with something I bet On knows a lot about the history of sexology, and it has to do with understanding about homosexuals as a class of people, not just a behavior, that the thought at the time of sexual inversion and, oh, this is a different kind of person. This is a feminine man or a masculine girl. So if we can teach them to perform their proper gender roles, I mean, that term was not in existence, but to be a boy or a girl properly from the get-go, then that won't happen. And so from the 1920s, there was a real push to market clothes, colors, toys as for boys or for girls. But it was definitely about teaching boys to be masculine and straight and teaching girls to be feminine and submissive. And that's the early history of gendering childhood. And I think a lot of what's happening today, if we started to really, really gender childhood again at the next level at the end of the 20th century, it makes sense that the generational wave or reaction is, let's break the binary. I don't know what the reaction to that is. And that's really my fear, right? Is that the reaction to breaking the binary, which is a much more radical than anything that's happened before, is right wingers coming in and revoking gay marriage, making even gender nonconformity, illegal. Like they're going after no fault divorce. The backlash is very frightening. And I think that's why we have to have difficult, unpleasant conversations about the current understanding of gender, which is, I think, very different than what's come before.
Change is inevitable, but people don't like to be forced to change. And when change happens too rapidly and too forcefully, and people can't make sense of where it's coming from, they're confused by it, there's going to be that pushback. And it's really unfortunate because it seems like we do have two polarized groups of people with a particular set of beliefs that are fighting against each other, which I believe are probably a minority of people in the United States, adults in particular, that the majority of people understand nuance and complexity and can have reasonable dialogue around these issues. But in large part, we're not. And I think for a reason you mentioned, which is the backlash that can come from that, where people can get piled on social media and their workplace can put them on suspended leave with no pay because of the idea of maybe what they did, whether it was true or not. I'm thinking of that physician assistant, right? And I think it was in New York, right, with the rental bike, where she was let go or suspended based on something that happened on a video. So it's really harsh what can happen. And you experienced some of it in the response to your article, right? The harshness that comes with that. But change is inevitable. And I would hope that we wouldn't get to the place where people are going to react in such strong ways that they start shutting down all the gains that have been made. Because you have an audience of young people that don't understand all the gains we made. They're just looking at right now and saying it's bad, it's terrible. We need this, this, and this. And we have that, and that. You're arguing for something else that's beyond those things, we have the marriage, and we have serving in the military, and we have adoption, and we have workplace discrimination protection. We have a lot of these things. We have with the Affordable Care Act, we have non-discrimination in getting access to health care. What we need is patience, because now we have to trust that the system's going to work, that the legal system, the justice system is going to come in and say, okay, pump the brakes, people. You can't pass an ordinance like that. You can't write a policy like that. You can't pass a law like that. You can't do it. And so we've went from 400 and something bills that have been proposed and a few hundred that have been passed and now challenged in the courts. And so with the numbers dwindling down because these things are being challenged. I live in Florida, and we now have a legal challenge to the more recent thing that our governor put into place around healthcare access for minors and even for adults. And so it's being challenged in the courts. We'll see. I trust the system. I'm a social worker. I work in the system, so I trust the system. I know the system is not perfect. It is fallible, but I trust in it to work out for the better good most of the time.
When you met with these individuals, what came of that?
I had a great time with Kate Bornstein. She gave me a lot of time. She explained her point of view. I put it in my book. I mean, mostly it was people explaining their points of view to me and me respecting them. I didn't have enough information, experience, community, or conviction to push back on a lot of what they said. So I rolled those viewpoints into my book, but it's many years later. I've interviewed probably hundreds of people at this point who have been hurt. And I don't mean harmed, I mean hurt by what we call the gender affirming model. And I don't think that the lessons most young people in America are being taught about gender, this massive generational shift from gender is a series of expectations and stereotypes based on your sex to gender is an innate feeling inside you about your maleness or femaleness or neither. That's not my definition. And I think for gender nonconforming children, it's a very dangerous definition because it teaches you that there's something wrong with your body. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with your body. You may grow up and choose to change your body like Zander, who wanted to move through the world with more ease. I am trying to create a world in which such children can move through the world with more ease, but not by making everything safe for them, but by A, fortifying them for a world that doesn't understand them, and B, trying to get people to not make a big deal out of gender nonconformity one way or another, to not try to make any meaning out of it. Vast majority of such kids grow up to be gay. Some choose to transition. Some just get good jobs because they are comfortable with men and masculinity when we're talking about the girls. So they can be advertising creative directors because they're used to being with men. Much more difficult for the feminine boys. And I would like to make space for them. But my goal in talking about this is to get us to stop talking about it and to basically say a few words about gender to children and then shut up.
We are going to take our first commercial break. We'll be right back.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
We are back from our commercial break. Our guest is journalist Lisa Selin Davis.
So when my daughter went to kindergarten, there was a kid who couldn't understand it. It created real cognitive dissonance. And that was reasonable. That was reasonable for him to feel that way. He'd never seen a girl like this. And the school had no other kids like this at the time. And so the parent coordinator said, why don't you arm your child with something to tell children? something to explain when she goes in the bathroom. She's navigating the world. The world is as it is. And I thought, like, that's really interesting advice. And then the kindergarten teacher gave one speech about girls and boys can look and dress all kinds of ways and play with whoever they want. And then it really wasn't an issue. Now it's many years later, that parent coordinator who told me that has a trans child who fits very squarely into the rapid onset category. And the school suddenly has so many trans children. This is an elementary school that they have their own kind of like lobbying arm and have never asked me to participate. Of course, the person who actually like wrote a book on this and spends all my time writing and thinking about it, because my ideas are unacceptable. And my ideas are mostly like, let's not ask the world to rearrange itself completely based on the subjective reality or understanding early on in a child's cognitive development of sex and gender. Let's just make a lot of room, stop thinking of toys as having a sex, right? A male toy and a female toy. They don't have a sex. Have whatever haircut you want. You like pink, go for it. Boys or girls. Don't shame girls for being feminine. Don't shame boys for being feminine. Don't celebrate boys for being masculine. Don't celebrate girls for being masculine, because that does happen in liberal areas. I'm having trouble getting these ideas taken up by anyone because I'm just kind of like, I don't fit anywhere, but they seem, I think in a way, the most hilarious part of the position I am in is that I am presenting myself as a voice of reason. And everyone who knows me well is like, wow, the world is really bananas if you are presenting yourself as the voice of reason. And I'm like, yeah, that's how upside down it is.
My partner and I have had conversations about this so many times because we still insist on the ideal male version, whatever that is in whatever culture, and the ideal female version. And nothing can veer from that. And I struggle with that. I identify as a trans guy, but I also gender bend. Doesn't happen very often. Even within my community, and Zander, I'd love to hear your take on this. Even in my community, I've had trans people tell me I'm not trans enough. I think what they're really saying is you don't look male-ish enough for me to accept you as trans. I think that we are so insistent on having the binary. And I think that's part of the struggle, maybe, with even clinicians. I feel it all the time when I navigate through my community.
I feel like I have received the message not so much in the last couple of years, and I think that's mostly because I'm just not paying attention. I'm not going into the same kinds of spaces that I used to go into when I lived in California and I was going to trans events all the time. I don't do that here in Orlando. I get a similar message of not trans, but it's not for that reason. It's actually due to the opposite of that. Because I'm so masculine presenting, I'm now a cis heteronormative binary reinforcing trans medicalist cis looking scumbag, right? Like this kind of rhetoric that comes out of our community of not trans enough is applied in so many different directions that because of what hormones have done for me, right? My hair on the top of my head is gone. I've got this big bushy beard. I've got the voice that I got. I was already 5'9" and built, like, as a friend of mine told me once, like a refrigerator, or my shoulders and my hips are like the same width. That's just my genetics and probably my ethnicity as a Hispanic man, right? What the testosterone has done for me. But I went through a period where I was like kind of genderqueer and androgynous, and even on T for the first couple of years, and there were no problems. But as soon as I started looking and sounding like I look and sound now, that is when the trouble started for me. And I was being referred to as a trans medicalist, or a person who is endorsing or supporting or uplifting a heteronormative, cis-normative vision of transness. And it's like, that's just who I am. You be how you are. I've never told anybody you're not trans enough. You do anything you want to do. Be however you want to be. I was very much an androgynous member of lesbian community for like 20 something years. Being part of lesbian community, I saw all kinds of ways that women were presenting themselves. I don't understand why we can't do that in the trans world. There does seem to be a pretty nasty response to those of us who just want to be men in society. I think part of it is also because I acknowledge that I have a female sex, and that really sets people off. And I take biology as a form of science that has some truths to it, and I accept those truths. And if things come to pass, right, through evolutionary biology, if we all of a sudden things are completely different and we're not a dimorphic species, and it turns out, then I will take that into consideration. But so far, that's what the evolutionary psychologists, or biologists have determined, that nothing has, even with intersexuality or DSD or differentiation of sex differentiation, or disorders of sex different, like, we're still this dimorphic species. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay acknowledging that. We have spent a whole lot of time on this one book, Tomboy, and I want us to be able to get into Housewife, if you want to give us a little bit about that as well.
Well, okay, but I feel like we have so much more to.
We could.
I mean,
We'll come back to it.
Yeah, let's do Housewife at the end, because it's not coming out till March. And
okay, good. Yeah.
So, because Ann brought up some things that both of you that I'm thinking about. And one is that, there is this emerging field of non-binary medicine. And so I think that there are more and more people who want to be in the middle, but still, like, we're still medicalizing that. And I was kind of curious. I mean, you don't have to talk about this, Ann, but I was curious, like, if you hadn't taken medicine and why not. And I was also curious sort of why what you get from identifying as a trans guy as opposed to being a masculine woman.
I don't identify with women.
It seems like it has nothing to do with you, like it's over there.
It's very foreign to me. It always has been. I'm not on the same track as what I think has become the normative statements that you hear from people who identify trans, who say, well, I knew my whole life. I didn't know my whole life. I just knew I was different, but for different reasons, not the gender identity reason. I was different, I think, because I was always very artistic. I was different just because I didn't think like everybody else. And I knew that I knew very early on. But the identity factor didn't kick in until much later in my life. I've been on hormones for years. What I struggle with is that my voice never really drops because I have gone very slowly. I just try to proceed with caution because I don't want to end up with a heart attack. I don't want to end up with a stroke. I was a long distance runner for years up until recently. And it was just a period there where I couldn't do any of that. But then I picked right back up, and I've always been very health conscientious. At one point, I dropped testosterone and I did different types of dosing and went from injections to the gel. My hematocrit went up. And so I couldn't do the gel. So then I went back to the injections, and then I did some research and I found out that nandrolone, you don't tend to lose hair. Well, I already started the hair loss route. Nothing like Zander, but I now use medication as an applied shampoo medication. It's very strong and I use that. I've stayed on nandrolone. It's worked very well for me. And the reality check is I'll probably never be the presentation that people expect me to be. Now, every now and then someone will clock me, and it's because they get me. And I don't know anything about them. They've never met me, but somehow they clock me, and it's all good. Other times I get a vibe, the person has struggles. So they clock me, and maybe it's a transphobic thing, or maybe it's just they clock me because I remind them of someone they know who's trans, who knows? And it's not always a good vibe. And so I've had to gauge my whole existence around safety. I'm not transsexual in the sense that I've had the actual trans surgery, but I am medically treated. it'll always be a situation where I just have to let things roll off my back because I can't get angry with people when they don't clock me as a guy. I can't get angry with them. I screw up sometimes. I remember one time I worked for this filming department years ago for Alyeska Pipeline back in the day when I was just very young. And all the engineers' wives came from all over the US. This was in Alaska. And we were sitting around the table, and one of the women, I asked her if she was pregnant, and the whole table got quiet. And she looked at me and she said, "I'm not pregnant." Many moments in my life where I've just completely shoved both feet down my throat.
But I bet you're one of those people that ask women how old they are too.
I always ask people how old they are.
Well, I was thinking about binaries and borders and boundaries. And as humans, I think we make sense of the world in binaries, right? Like what's safe and what's not safe, right? And that's one of the reasons to clock sex in someone, right? And as sex partners, from evolutionary urge that some people don't have, but to reproduce, and that's how we navigate the world and how we make sense of things, and it makes us feel safe and sane. And the same with borders and boundaries. And we're in this very boundaryless period where you have people arguing to redefine or get rid of binaries. And it's very destabilizing for a lot of people who might have been willing to say, like, okay, I understand both of you wanting to go in this direction and how you understand yourselves and why you needed to change yourself. But I don't want to reorient like the entire understanding of sex and gender based on this experience, which I also relate to. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be conservative, because I find myself resisting what I think of as the very extreme place we're going. And I thought of three things that I don't know if we have time for, but I wanted to know what each of you wished had happened in your childhood, what you wish, how you wish people had been educated, or if you wish you had been accommodated in some other way, and how you feel about childhood medicalization. And I just wanted to say, before you answer those questions, gender medicalization, I wanted to just like briefly talk about my experience, like where I was raised mostly by a single mom, very short-haired, looked very lesbianish, but wasn't a lesbian, but didn't shave her armpits. When she eventually married my stepfather when I was in 7th grade, he was hardcore feminist. I had a lot of messages about challenging gender norms. I don't shave my legs or armpits now, but I discovered last year at 50, I always felt very ugly. I had really weird shaped hands. They're my dad's hands, really crooked fingers, horrible little funny shaped nails. And I just felt horrible. I felt horrible about my body. I felt horrible about my face. The other girls had normal hands and they could paint their nails. I couldn't even paint my nails because I wouldn't want to draw attention to them. Like I had asked my stepmother, could I get an operation to have normal fingernails? And I just was soaked in shame. It was very hard for me to even take my clothes off in front of people. And that's a different experience. I want to acknowledge that some of us can't necessarily relate to your experience, but have been absolutely tortured by societal gender norms.
I had a lot of encouragement, mostly in being gender nonconforming and tomboyish from my father. I was raised also by a single parent, but it was my dad. I didn't have any pushback from that. My mother, my paternal grandmother, and my aunts on my father's side of the family, they weren't too happy with it, but he kept most of it at bay from me. It didn't really land on me much. The little bit that it did, I'm a very external processor, or I'm externalized in my processing. So I didn't take those messages in as actually anything wrong about me. I just thought those people were crazy for thinking that way. They were the wrong ones, not me. I think we need more information. We need more research into what does taking a pause mean, right? That's what people are saying. We're taking a pause by giving children medications that stop puberty from happening. Why are we doing it? What's happening in the body when they're suspended? And what does it mean if when they come off those puberty suppressing medications, they don't go through a natural natal puberty, they go through a puberty as a result of exogenous hormones that are being injected or topically applied to their body. That hasn't been studied. We have no idea what that means. So when I hear people say, oh, puberty blocking medications are reversible, you just go off them and then you go into puberty. Well, I think some of the studies are now showing that majority of the kids who go on these puberty suppressing medications go on to cross-sex hormone therapy or gender affirming hormone therapy or hormone replacement therapy. You hear it being said in a lot of different ways. They're not going through their natal puberty, and nobody's testing that. Nobody's following those kids. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get some good data out of places like Sweden and Finland and Norway and England, which are now going to start tracking these kids and trying to find out what are the outcomes. So that's what I think about that.
This is our second commercial break. We will be back shortly.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
We are back from our second commercial break. Our guest this hour is journalist Lisa Selin Davis. Let's pick up where we left off.
I'm hopeful that we're going to get some good data out of places like Sweden and Finland and Norway and England, which are now going to start tracking these kids and trying to find out what are the outcomes. So that's what I think about that.
Been doing research on the informed consent. What's missing from it? I had to look at law reviews because I wasn't finding much in the Department of Mortality. I came across one case, Georgia man who passed away, was transitioning to male, had a hysterectomy, and that resulted in sepsis. And there were all these preconditions. And I wondered, did they know about the preconditions? And it looked and sounded like when I read that they knew about them. So that was one concern. The other concern is male to female. And if they desire sexual intercourse, the vagina has to have a depth in order for that to happen. And the only way that they can make that happen, because they haven't had a chance to develop, right, so that when they invert the penis, there's enough there. They can't do it if they've been on puberty blockers for a number of years.
I've known that since the very, very beginning when I started in the Netherlands in the 90s. A known problem from the beginning.
They had a 16-year-old who was in a Dutch case study who also died. The problem comes in when they've been on puberty blockers and their penis never developed to its full size. Ordinarily, they would invert the penis if it were full size. That would create enough depth. But in a case where the individual has been on puberty blockers and that penis never developed, they can't do much with it. And so therefore, they have to take from the intestines to create enough depth. So there are issues that need addressing, and we need transparency. We do not have transparency in this field of gender study. It's a 1% of the population where you have these persisters who from 2 years old never change their identity. They are who they say they are. Again, it's not the majority. And so I do think we have to proceed with caution.
Well, I think that part of what we're struggling with in our culture is the range of normal and how far to move the needle or the red line, as some people call it. And I have always felt like I had a pretty wide range of normal. And when I was 5 or so, I moved to Georgia. My parents got divorced. We moved from a super hippie town. Although, I mean, looking back, actually, it was probably mostly Republicans, but there was a big hippie community there. It was very hard for me to make friends. And I finally made a friend. And when my mom who I'd mentioned was very short haired and Jewish and single and different than most people there. She picked me up from this very first play date. And I said, I had such a good time. When I grow up, I want to be gay and marry Kelly, the little girl. And I almost like didn't have friends the whole time we lived in Georgia. I realize now, like, maybe it's because that got around, right? That I said my plan was to be gay. And I think that would have been great if that had worked out. I would have much preferred that, but you cannot make yourself gay, it turns out. Nonetheless, from a very young age, my range of normal included gay. There are people I'm in contact with who have a narrower range of normal than I do. And it makes me uncomfortable, but then I have people who have a much wider range, and that makes me uncomfortable too. And I'm understanding the resistance to this, to widening the range of normal to include quote unquote sex changes for children, or to teach young children about the idea of pansexuality, or et cetera, right? As I said before, like, ultimately my goal is to not ruminate about sex, gender, or sexuality, right? They get lots of stuff by osmosis through the culture, but ruminating about that stuff instead of playing on the monkey bars, to me, does not seem good for your mental health. And it seems very, very focused on these allegiances. And we seem very obsessed, like maybe in the absence of boundaries, we're getting more obsessed with more tribal, right? We have less religion, but we have more tribalism. There's so much going on in our culture right now, and it's impossible to figure out. I am often begging us to stop seeing the fight over gender and children as left versus right, because I think there are tons of lefties and liberals and LGBT folks who are concerned about children and gender medicine, and who are even concerned about what kids are learning in school. If we don't create an environment where we can talk about this strange situation we find ourselves in, and how difficult it is to figure out what's the appropriate range of normal, then we're just locked in this forever culture war, and we don't get reform, and we don't ever get synthesis. We just have thesis and antithesis battling each other forever. And it's exhausting and not fun. And we probably have things that we disagree on. And yet it's probably more interesting for all of us to talk to each other about them than to impugn or try to destroy one another because of our differences.
I think there's probably not enough attention to the developmental capacities of children. Are we introducing pansexuality to second graders, to seventh graders, or to 11th graders? Paying attention to what is age appropriate, and not just how can we talk about pansexuality that's age appropriate for a second grader. No. Pansexuality is probably something that should be in high school. If we're going to teach about these different things, let's keep it to the higher levels. If people understood that developmentally teaching some of the topics that people want to teach nowadays are just too outside of the cognitive range of children, could exacerbate any sort of anxiety or worry that they naturally are, sort of their temperament is oriented towards, that it's going to create more angst and not understanding. And it's going to create division and not connection. I don't think they're paying attention to the possibility of that. They just want to.
Yeah, I think we need to have a bit of a reckoning, especially after the pandemic, when kids are really far behind, when a lot of children are having academic struggles. And we know that we're very behind internationally on our kids getting properly educated. And it's okay for us to ask, what's appropriate for children to learn in school? What can be left up to their families? What's age appropriate? Where is that red line? We could have a whole conference on the red line and, never come to a consensus, but we could have a lot of really interesting discussions about it. I'd love to see us moving toward that. And I think it's very hard in a polarized nation in which everyone gets power and money from polarization. And those of us having these conversations that are defying that, we know, you must get a lot of feedback on how much people enjoy it, what a relief it is for people when they hear people having nuanced discussions. But I think nuance is becoming rarer and rarer and harder to maintain as each side ratchets up its inflammatory language and legislation.
Absolutely. I love having really interesting conversations. This has been a very interesting conversation. I'm sure that our listeners are going to enjoy it very much. There's so much more I'd love to talk to you about, Lisa. I'd love for you to be able to come back. We'd love to have you on again. If you can, just really briefly give us a synopsis of Housewife. And what I'd like to ask you also is I'd like to have you come back because I really want to hear about your experience going over to Ireland and attending both the European Professional Association for Transgender Health conference and the GenSpect conference. It was both happening at the same time in the same location in Ireland. And then I'd love again also to talk to you about your Substack and some of the really wonderful articles that you're writing there. Your Substack is Broadview, which I love that play on words. But let's hear a little bit about Housewife just briefly before we end.
I'm happy to come back and talk to you both anytime. And the Housewife book is about a social history of the housewife in America, although it starts with Paleolithic female hunters and goes through radical ethnic working class housewives of the 30s and gets up to the pandemic when all these women were sort of forced again into housewifery in order to educate their children. And then it looks at how our society is built on the assumption of housewifery. So everything from why first ladies don't get paid. They're the only more than full-time employee in the White House with no salary, to our lack of any kind of infrastructure to make stay-at-home parents financially secure. And I was kind of continuing in the tomboy housewife. I had a whole bunch of other ideas, bitch, downers, about negative thinkers. So I do hope to have a whole series, but I'm also trying to write a book about the gender culture war and how it happened. So we'll see. But the Housewife book comes out March 5th, and I'd love to come back and talk about it. And I'd also love to talk to you both about what I saw in Killarney and how it affected me and what I've been writing about, because I have been trying to take this very nuanced approach and to write about gender and kids in a way that liberals can understand and write things they can share with each other. But I will say, after I went to Ireland and went to a conference of gender medical professionals and then people essentially hurt by gender medicine, that mission has been much harder to continue with.
I bet. Well, I'm so thankful that you came on the show today, and I'm really looking forward to having you back on and hearing all about Ireland and more about your Substack as well. Thank you, Lisa.
Really great to talk with you both. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the Umbrella Hour with Dr. On and Zander Keig. We hope you tune in to our next show. Our guest will be Dr. Tristan Cotton. Thank you for listening.